Corlia. I'm standing to speak to this group of amendments, and specifically amendment numbers 33, 36 and 38 in my own name on behalf of the Social Democrats. And, you know, this group of amendments, I think probably all opposition parties are represented in this group of amendments because we're very much on the same page, of the same opinion in relation to what needs to be done in order to strengthen our firepower in responding to COVID. And it's quite clear that the government actually isn't serious about this at all. They're going through the motions. Yesterday I referred to it as a box-ticking exercise. But this isn't going to achieve what needs to be achieved in terms of controlling the importation of the virus. It simply will not do that. It's not even a half measure. Because we know that from the very beginning, the government's record on travel has been absolutely abysmal. I have often referred to it as the single biggest failing of this government in response to COVID. And sometimes people have said, well, what about, you know, the scandal of what happened, all of the deaths in the nursing homes? What about the fact that young people have been out of school for so long? What about all of the mental health problems? And yes, they're all really serious. But the point is that we had an opportunity to change the course of where the country was going. We had an opportunity last summer when we got the daily figures down to 4. And at that stage, if the government had controlled travel, this would have been a very different country. And we wouldn't have the recent history, the scandalous history that we have had. And it is so blindingly obvious that in a pandemic, as well as all of the internal measures that need to be put in place, you have to stop the importation of the virus. And that was blindingly obvious last year when we thought there was just the one type of virus. It's all the more important now at this stage with the various variants, because we simply don't know what way the virus is going to behave. There are so many unknowns about this into the future. And that's why it's absolutely essential that measures are put in place to stop us importing the virus. Now, it is so blindingly obvious that you have to ask, why did this government not take steps to address this? Why did the last government actually not do that either? And I just wonder, where is the pressure coming from on government? What kind of lobbying has there been? Because we know that at various stages when the government announced new approach or new measures to the virus, they didn't speak to the opposition parties. They did speak to, the business lobbies and cleared it with them that it was okay. And it seems that they are their masters. And there are a whole lot of questions about why we didn't do this. And I know that there was a lot of opposition to interfering with international business travel, for example, but that could have been dealt with. And I know there was a lot of concern in relation to the aviation industry, and rightly so, and certainly those of us on the north side of Dublin are only too conscious of the damage that has been done to the aviation industry. But regrettably, that was actually happening anyway because of the fact that the world now is dealing with a pandemic. And there was no demand, no substantial demand for aviation and for international travel. And of course, the government should have moved at an early stage and moved in a much more determined way to support aviation, to support Aer Lingus, to support all of the many, many workers associated with aviation in this country, and to provide those kind of supports so that that industry could survive. And unfortunately, those supports are inadequate. You haven't done enough. But, I mean, it just showed a very warped, strange way of thinking when a couple of weeks ago, when I was raising the need for quarantining, the Taoiseach said, he accused me and my party of being hypocritical because we were looking for supports for the aviation sector. But they're two sides of the same coin. given the damage that has been done by the pandemic to aviation, the government should have been supporting it and ensuring that there would be a future for aviation when we get through this pandemic. But pretending somehow that, that aviation will survive in a pandemic is just dishonest. And that's what's hypocritical. And it's absolutely logical that, on the one hand, looking for controls in relation to the importation of the virus, and also looking for proper supports for aviation, go hand in hand. And that's why many of us have been talking about that for so long. So back to why it is that the government is not taking action in a way that is obvious that they should be doing. And again, you have to ask, what are the other pressures they've come under? I mean, questions have been raised by Deputy Smith there about seasonal workers, for example. Low-paid workers coming in from Brazil and coming in from, Eastern Europe, and coming in pretty large numbers. And we have many industries, whether it's seasonal or not, there are many industries that are dependent on that business model. Large numbers of pretty vulnerable people coming in from other places in the world and coming in here, working in pretty poor conditions very often, for low pay and little security. So is that the concern, that there's a threat to that business model? We know, obviously, in relation to the meat industry and the fact that that is dependent on large numbers of low-paid workers. And we know the outbreaks there, and we're seeing those again now. So why has nothing been done about that? And is it that the government is coming under pressure from business interests not to interfere with that business model? Because if that's the case, I think the public just will not forgive you for your failures in this area. Look, the opposition are united in relation to this. We're all speaking with one voice. The public are saying it's obvious. Why is the government not taking steps to control the importation of the virus? And if you go back looking to what happened from the very beginning, the half measures that were put in place, it started off with self-isolation. A tiny fraction of that was overseen and checked. We knew that. I mean, I've been tracking this month on month since the very beginning. Then we moved to the advice being restrict your movements. And again, there was no oversight, no monitoring of that whatsoever. A fraction of people were contacted. They even stopped ringing people. And they started sending out text messages. So no longer do they even expect people to restrict their movements. And then, of course, we had what happened over Christmas, where people were being advised to quarantine in their bedrooms when they'd come home for Christmas. Absolute nonsense. I mean, did you really think anybody would adhere to that? And we're back into that situation now, where for most countries, other than the 20 here that are on the designated list, that people are being told to quarantine at home. That is nonsense. Quarantine at home is a contradiction in terms. Quarantine means isolating from other people so you don't pass on the virus. People can't do that if they're sharing accommodation with family members or housemates or whatever. And the idea that the guards are going to be going around knocking on doors, checking that people are isolating in their own home. I mean, you didn't even understand it yourself, Minister, when you fluffed that when you were trying to explain it. And I don't think any of your colleagues understand it or even have any confidence that it will work. Again, it's just throwing shapes at this. Half measures where you're not serious. And, the idea now of bringing in this legislation where you're talking about 20 countries, designated countries. Like, I've checked the data that's provided on arrivals here since Christmas, and there's been about 75,000 people coming in, flying into this country have flown into this country since Christmas. And we look at those 20 countries, there's only one of them actually on the list, the UAE, and about 7% of all travellers are from the UAE. There's no information on the other 19 countries, for example. So what is the percentage of people that come to this country from those 20 countries that you're designating. I mean, but by all accounts, it seems to be a small percentage. But we don't know because there's no transparency about that. And Minister, I want to ask you specifically, will you provide that information that tells us the number of people who are travelling from those 20 countries? Because the data that you're providing at the moment is only data based on the last country of departure, not the original country of departure. And that's what we need. And, you know, in the interest of transparency, Minister, I don't know if you're listening or not, but I would just say to you that in the interest of transparency, it is really important that you provide that information. Because otherwise we don't know, you know, even within the limited terms of those 20 countries, how many people are coming here? Is this supposed mandatory quarantining having any impact on those numbers? So at a very minimum, you need to provide those figures on a weekly basis on the basis of the country of origin. But of course, when you look at those figures, the big numbers of people coming in here, relatively speaking, are coming from the United States and European countries. And there's nothing been done about that at all. Nothing been done about that. So you're not serious. It's quite clear that you're not. And again, I would have to stress that we know that much of the difficulty in this country, many of the reasons why we have and continue to have such high levels of the virus here is because of the level of importation. It started off last March, people coming from Italy. The rugby cancelled, but large numbers of people came here. I had people on to me from Beaumont Hospital before that weekend, pleading with me to get in touch with the Minister for Health, because they knew that this was going to be a disaster, having large numbers of people coming in from the epicentre of it at that stage, from Italy. And I passed those concerns on to the Minister, but nothing was done, of course, about it. We also know that Cheltenham, major mistake that was made, that we allowed travel back and forth to Cheltenham, and we paid a huge price for that. The failure to deal with it in the summer meant that we got the Spanish variant, and, you know, that was responsible for then what happened in the autumn. Then Christmas, we know what happened there with Britain. Now there's the Brazilian variant, there's the South African variant that are on this island. Next will undoubtedly be the Californian variant, and who knows what others. So look, all of these were raised with you. They were raised with your predecessor. There wasn't action taken. We were told consistently, in spite of the fact that NEFIT spelt out very clearly what was required last May. We were told consistently by you, Minister, by the Taoiseach and by the Taoiseach that the problem wasn't travel related. But of course, we know it absolutely was. And you were quoting figures and saying, oh, the travel-related ones are very low. That was only because we didn't know where transmission was taking place, because the public health doctors, that service was so under-resourced. But where there were opportunities for public health doctors, where they did have time on occasions to actually trace back the 14 days, which we should have been doing with all cases, of course they found you have one person coming back into this country from the west of Ireland, and one person then infects 56. Or there's the other, you know, a small number of cases there that explained to people how one person or two people coming in can infect their whole community, family members, and all of that kind of thing. So, you know, this, as I say, was blindingly obvious. It should have been dealt with. It's not being dealt with now, and it won't be dealt with under this legislation. You are not serious about what you're doing. This government is not serious. And people can only come to the conclusion that if this goes on, if we continue having to live in what is pretty close to a zombie state now, and no prospect of things opening up to a substantial extent in the foreseeable future, people cannot continue like that. There has to be a pathway out of where we are at the moment. And the only way we will chart that pathway is if there are measures put in place to drive down the daily figures, if we've proper testing and retrospective tracing, and if we stop the importation of the virus. That's the only way we can get through this. And if we're serious about this, we could get through it in a matter of 2 to 3 months, at which point we could then open up domestically. That's the reward for having a real strategy that is meaningful. Unfortunately, that's not there. The government is not serious about this. And Minister, I put it to you, if you fail again, if the government fails again in relation to travel, if we are facing into a 4th lockdown at some point in the not too distant future, you will not be forgiven for that. There are alternatives. They've been spelt out to you. We can do things so much better. We can have a better future. But people will not forgive you unless you do the right thing. Thank you.